Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar from NCVO in Trends in Volunteering. My name is Claire Ahrens. I'm the Training Coordinator here at NCVO, and I'm delighted to also welcome Jarina Chowdhury, who's the Volunteering Development Consultant at NCVO, and also behind the scenes, Lauren Bernard is doing the webinar organisation. So sit back, relax. What we're going to do is Jarina's going to present for around 30 minutes, telling you about trends in volunteering, and then we're going to have 15 minutes questions and answers. Thank you to those that have already submitted your questions. If you want to submit a question throughout this webinar, please type in the chat box to the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. After this, there'll be a short follow-up survey when you're exiting the webinar, so please do complete it and give us any feedback. Okay, and now Jarina's going to talk you through the aims of this webinar.
Hello, I'm Jarina. By the end of the webinar today, you will understand the UK picture on volunteering, have explored the role of the internet and how this is shaping volunteering, take away 3 new ways you can reshape or enhance your volunteering offer. So, we're going to cover the UK volunteering scene, innovative projects and campaigns, and what does the volunteer of the future look like. So we're going to look at what's been happening to date, and we're going to look at what's influencing how people give their time. And we'll be using data from the NCVO Almanac, which is produced annually and is available in hard copy and online to NCVO members. I'm going to show you data from 2015 to 16. People complete the government's Community Life Survey, which asks about volunteering. And we'll also use data from our latest publication, Getting Involved, How People Make a Difference. So the NCVO research team gathered this and other data, for example, financial data from the Charities Commission and from the voluntary sector and NCVO members. And then that team interprets the data, and this informs the annual almanac. So we're going to be looking for patterns and clues as to what's happening with volunteering, and we're going to look at volunteers' relationship with volunteering. So before we dive into the data, let's just remind ourselves what we mean by volunteering. So you'll be very familiar with this. This is the NCVO definition, which is derived from the United Nations definition of volunteering. It bears 3 characteristics that are: volunteering is unpaid, a person is doing something to benefit society or others who are not relatives, volunteering is a voluntary act and done of their own free will. So you may notice throughout the webinar that not all of these initiatives that I describe meet these 3 characteristics. So for example, many of you will be familiar with employer-supported volunteering. However, you may argue that an activity that's organised for employees where they have no choice but to participate is not really a voluntary act. And you could say it's not volunteering because they're being paid. Others might go so far to say that team building days organised by employers don't really constitute real volunteering. So it's all good stuff, and it's worth warming up our brains and broadening our horizons. So we're going to do a quick poll. And the question is, how many people do you think volunteered in the year 2015 to 2016? And we ask you to choose from one of 3. So you could choose 8.3 million, or you could choose 10.7 million, or 14.2 million. Given that the UK population is about 66 million, you might feel that these are quite small numbers, but we'll see what the poll says. Apparently economists are quite good at being way off the target with this, so maybe we can do better. So the results are in, and we can see what you think. So 16% of you thought 8.3 million, and 30% of you thought 14.2 million. And most of you, 54%, thought 10.7 million. Well done to all of you. However, the people who put 14.2 million are the winners. There you go, slightly delayed, and we're going to look at formal volunteering now. So there's good news. Rates of both formal and informal volunteering, first of all, we're going to look at formal volunteering, have been largely unchanged since 2001, which is when we started recording this data. So in that year, 2015 to 16, just over 1 in every 4 adults, which is 27% of respondents, volunteered at least once a month. So that's the same as the 2013 to 2014 and the 2014 to 2015 figures, which is very healthy. So regular volunteers gave on average in that year 11.6 hours per month. So the picture of formal volunteering is fairly consistent. And don't forget that lots of people volunteer and don't know about the Community Life Survey, or they don't fill it in. So the number of formal volunteers is likely to be even greater, which is really good news. We're now going to look briefly at informal volunteering. So informal volunteering is different in that it means giving unpaid help to individual people who are not relatives, but not through a group, club or organisation, whereas formal volunteering is through a group, club or organisation. So 60% of adults reported volunteering informally at least once in the last year, and 34% volunteered at least once a month. So irregular informal volunteering, which means volunteering once a year, and again, not through a group, club or organisation, has dropped from a peak of 68% in 2005, which is quite interesting. So the estimated average informal volunteering hours per month among people who reported regular informal volunteering was 7.1 hours. So you can imagine informal volunteering is quite hard to capture because it's outside of an organisation or group. It's safe to say, however, that far more informal volunteering is taking place and that we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. So let's look briefly then at the types of organisations that attract volunteers. So what do you think are the most popular then? Sports organisations and groups attract the most volunteers. 50% of those who'd formally volunteered at least once in the last 12 months had supported clubs involved in sports or exercise. And also, it may come as no surprise to you that fundraising and running events are the most popular types of volunteering activities. So just under half of respondents, so that's 47%, of people who volunteered formally at least once in 2015 to 16 were involved in organising or helping to run an activity or event. And 45% had been involved with raising or handling money or taking part in sponsored events. And if you like all this and you want to know more about volunteering data, we've included a link to the NCVO Almanac so you can look much more closely at this and other data relating to the voluntary sector. Remember that this gives us a picture of what's happening nationally. But interestingly, it's not just voluntary organisations that are engaging volunteers. The number of people involved in public services are also significant. Over 3 million people volunteer in the health and care sector. About 300,000 people are school governors, and about 100,000 people help to run libraries. And if you like this and you want more detail, we've included a link to Getting Involved, How People Make a Difference, which is a very new publication we released this week, and you'll find the link at the end of the slides. So, question for you now then is, what do you think is shaping how people give their time? So we're going to do another poll, and I'd like you to choose one of these 5, please. How much time people feel they have to give, access and ability to go online, lifestyles, the volunteer experience, whether it's good or bad, the range of volunteering opportunities available. If you could just choose one, I'll be very grateful. Or you may think that there are things on here that there are things that are not on this poll that you would like to comment on. So in which case, we invite you to share your thoughts, because there'll be 15 minutes at the end of the webinar. And we're very much welcome to, to hear what you have to say about what you think influences how people give their time. So the results are in. And I'm just looking at them now. I'm sure you are. So 41% of you felt that how much time people feel they have to give is what influences how people give their time. And then the least one was access to and ability to go online, so that's 1%. What else? Lifestyles, 23%. The volunteer experience, whether it's good or bad, 17%. And then the range of volunteering opportunities available, quite close to that, with 18%. Well, thank you for your thoughts. It's likely that all of these are influencing how people give their time, as well as other factors. So these could be things like whether people are aware of what volunteering opportunities exist, whether they can afford to volunteer, whether perhaps time-consuming recruitment processes put them off, the appropriateness and quality of the inductional support they receive, or the recognition could also be another factor, which is linked to the volunteer experience, of course. So these are all factors which will undoubtedly influence whether people give their time and how they choose to. And then there's also the what's in it for me factor, as volunteering is not necessarily purely altruistic, and neither does it need to be in order for society or community to benefit. A thought for you: perhaps the days of the pure volunteer have gone or never really existed. Now let's look now at episodic volunteering or micro-volunteering. So what is that thing, micro-volunteering? Micro-volunteering is defined as small bite-sized volunteering with no commitment to repeat and with minimum formality, involving short and specific actions that are quick to start and complete. So this definition comes from NCVO research. We carried out this research, which concluded that demand for volunteering opportunities, often tasks that can be completed online or on smartphones, are growing, as they provide a more accessible and often instant form of volunteering. So growth for this type of volunteering has been and will continue to be driven by technology. However, it doesn't all have to be done online. So some really innovative initiatives have emerged that have been led by demands on volunteer time and lifestyles. So did you know, for example, that 15th of April is Micro-Volunteering Day? However, the research also revealed that there were mixed views about the term micro-volunteering. Some people felt that the word micro belittled people's contribution. So for volunteers and non-volunteers, it was considered not very intuitive, and some people couldn't really understand what it meant. Others disliked the term because it suggested little or no impact or importance. However, people quite liked the concept itself. They found the main features appealing: flexibility, low commitment, low obligation, especially for non-volunteers, who were often deterred from volunteering because of perceived obligation and heavy time commitments. So here then is a summary of some of the key features of micro or episodic volunteering, whichever you wish to call it. However, do remember that this can also be done offline. It doesn't necessarily have to involve being online, and it's best to offer people a variety of ways to give you their time. Leading on from that, and quite interestingly, the Good Things Foundation produced an annual Digital Nation infographic, and this one is from this year. It's quite recent. It's from September 2017. And from it, we can see there are 11.5 million people in the UK that don't have basic digital skills. That means they can't do things that you and I take for granted, like communicating online, transacting, or indeed accessing a webinar. We're living in a society where automation is on the rise, but this completely takes for granted that everyone is online, can afford to be, and even wants to be. The Good Things Foundation found that 4.8 million people have never been online. So, there's a strong link between digital and social exclusion. And we all know that people volunteer for social reasons, to meet friends and to feel included. So what this means is there are people who will be unable to volunteer online, and there will be those who simply don't want to, even if they can. And we should think about how to close the digital divide by developing skills and access to online volunteering, but we should also offer volunteering roles that don't require or demand people to be online. I'm now going to take you briefly through the pathways through participation research. So this is very easy to forget when people volunteer, that they actually have a whole backstory going on in their lives. So people's motivations and experiences of volunteering can be complex and are influenced by a range of personal factors and experiences. So this was another piece of research that NCVO was involved in, exploring participation of over 100 people in England. And the research found that participation is shaped by numerous factors that shift over time and are shaped by the impact of participation itself. And these factors operate on 5 levels. There's the individual level, which includes motivations, personality, identity, and resources. Relationships and social networks, including an individual's family and friends, neighbours, colleagues, and wider social networks. Groups and organisations through which people participate, including their structures, processes, and culture. Local environment and place, including local spaces, events, institutions, and politics, and wider societal and global influences. The research showed that engagement in volunteering is best understood as a journey over someone's life. It evolves over time in response to people's life stage and what's happening in their wider environment. And this infographic gives a nice summary of that. There are triggers, such as emotional reactions to a personal life event or an external influence, that can push or pull someone into or out of volunteering. So it's important for us to remember that people's journeys and experiences of volunteering will not always be linear. And this is why flexibility and understanding that people tread different pathways is important. And we need to make the most of what we know about how people engage with volunteering. In order to create a culture of volunteering where people are able to volunteer throughout their lives, then we need to build in the flexibility and pathways needed to support people on their journey. Now, we're going to talk about the word volunteering, and we're going to run a quick poll. Do you think the word volunteering is out of date or old-fashioned? We don't have too many categories for you here. It's yes, no, or not sure. But I'm hoping that you don't sit on the fence and that you don't all go for not sure. And I hope that you can be forthright in your opinion. Or you can share it at the end of the webinar and we can have a big debate about it. The results are in. So, right. So 63% said no, a firm no. 22% said yes, and 14% sat on the fence and said don't know. Of course, you know you must have an opinion. However, let's have a look then. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just a matter of opinion, isn't it? So, some of you will be familiar now with the high-profile campaign, I Will, And Step Up to Serve leads this cross-party backed campaign, which aims to double the number of young people aged 10 to 20 engaged in youth social action by the year 2020. And the whole idea behind it is that they're growing a generation of people who will be involved in social action or volunteering going forward. So they're raising a generation of young people who will always be involved at some stage in their life. So the campaign was set up in 2012, and it deliberately avoids the word volunteering. And government sees the value of engaging young people in social action and the benefits it can bring. The National Citizen Service and the International Citizen Service are both part of this. Through the campaign, businesses are also engaged and motivated to involve young people. So if you're working with young people, I suggest that you check out the I Will campaign. There's lots of resources on there as well on their website. So a question for us to think about then is, are we seeing a new language of volunteering? Is social action a rebrand of volunteering? Is it because the word volunteering doesn't really appeal to millennials? So Radio 1 has had great success getting young people pledging an hour of their time to help lots of charities to total 1 million hours of charitable giving time. However, they did use the word volunteering, but perhaps their success was more based around the fact that they're a radio station reaching large numbers of people, and of course they had lots of celebrities on their side encouraging young people to get involved. So something else for us to think about then in terms of exciting initiatives are embedding volunteering into the day-to-day routines that people have, so it's more subtly integrated into their lives. So the Casserole Club, for those of you who like casserole, is an example of how building in volunteering to people's routines doesn't make them think that it's something separate, it's part of what they do. So the Casserole Clubbers cook an extra portion of food to give to a neighbour, and the frequency is entirely up to them. So it could be once a month or every week, whatever works for the volunteer. And volunteers share extra portions of this food with people in their area who aren't always able to cook for themselves. So there's a social aspect to this as well. Another great example, which you will be familiar with, is Good Gym. So Good Gym have succeeded in embedding volunteering into people's lifestyle choices. So people who like a workout or a run, they can do their run and they can volunteer at the same time because they're befriending somebody. So what they do is they go on runs, which are sometimes called running missions, to make visits to isolated older people. And the isolated older people are called coaches because they motivate the volunteers to keep going. And then what do they do when they get there? Well, they stop and they have a chat, and they might do some odd jobs for them, simple jobs, maybe like clearing out their garden, changing some light bulbs, just doing things for people that they might struggle to do by themselves. And they'll, of course, spend some time with them. So there's a social aspect there as well. And they're also running and getting their sport fix. So the internet and social media is having a massive influence on volunteering. It's connecting people in communities through the use of social media, as you can see here. So North London and South London Cares is a good example of how this is happening. And the way they describe their work is quite interesting. They say, North London Cares is a community network of young professionals and older neighbours offering one another a little extra time, practical help, social connection and human companionship. So they're all about getting people to make social connections, and volunteering isn't mentioned. It isn't explicit at all. And their model recognises that it isn't just older people who might be lonely, and that young people might be lonely too. They might just be busy but lonely. They might be in a new city. They might have left behind a network of long-standing friends. They might have started a new career. So it's about bringing people from different age groups together, but not necessarily describing it as volunteering. So you can see from these great photos, which they've shared on Twitter, that both sides are sharing, how they're getting involved and telling their story of volunteering. So social media, in the same way that the internet, is shaping how people are able to craft and tell these stories about the connections that they're making. So In many ways, North London Cares and South London Cares, which is part of the same organisation, have successfully blended two types of approach because they've got the face-to-face element. They're bringing people together, but they're also telling that story online. So they've blended a nice online and offline mix. So we've talked about organisations and we've talked about people getting together through an organisation. However, there's quite an interesting development happening with people organising outside of organisations, proving that people don't really need organisations to volunteer. So informal volunteering, which we talked about earlier, is about self-organising around a cause or without a structure or without a brand. So whether it's UK floods or a volunteer-led event like a David Bowie tribute that was held in January 2016, should we be tapping into informal volunteering? How can we make the most of it to engage people the way they want to engage with us? How can we remove barriers and bureaucracy? Is the appeal that there's more power to the volunteer through informal volunteering? Volunteers sharing their experiences on social media makes the volunteer experience much more powerful and visible. And volunteering in migrant and refugee camps in Europe is another excellent example of how thousands of people have self-organised without the support or without the structure of a charity or NGO. People are showing less loyalty to brands and companies, and they're more concerned about other things. They may want to have more control and voice over their experience as a volunteer rather than just fitting into what's already existing. And they may be more demanding about the service or the experience that we can offer them. And of course, there's lots of competition for volunteers. So that means that there's something there for us to think about the quality of the experience that we're offering. Another type of exciting volunteering and quite unusual is Adam Lynn blogged for Volunteers Week earlier this year. He's a gamer and he loves a game called RuneScape. He's raised thousands of pounds for Macmillan by simply getting people to watch him play. He live streams his games and people pick up tips and they pay to do that. He's an ambassador for Macmillan and he's raised thousands of pounds just by volunteering to play his favourite game. There's also an organisation called Spice Time Credits that offer incentivised volunteering, which means that for every hour that an individual contributes to their community or service, they earn 1 time credit. And this time credit acts as currency and can be spent accessing an hour of leisure activity or service provided by one of their corporate or community partners, or it can be gifted to other people. So these are some examples of some of the more innovative ideas that have emerged in the last few years that you might like to learn from. So we're drawing near to the end of the webinar now, but we just want to have a quick word with you about the 65 plus age group. So the 65 to 74 age group is really active in volunteering regularly and irregularly. We know this from Almanac data. They are time rich, they have skills, they're experienced, and they want to keep busy. But we also have an aging population. People are living longer, mostly healthier, and those with disposable income see themselves as philanthropists. So the Commission on Voluntary Sector and Ageing was set up in August 2013 by New Philanthropy Capital and the International Longevity Centre UK. And they produced quite an interesting report for us to think about, saying that older people now and in the future are likely to face increasing demands on their time. They will be working for longer, retiring later, and may have caring responsibilities for a spouse and perhaps grandchildren. We need to offer flexibility and enable older people to shape their own projects and opportunities. We have recognised this in our need to engage young people or people of working age, but less so for the older generation. And one of the strongest recommendations comes from the Commission to us as volunteering organisations to develop new models of volunteering to attract people of all ages or lose out on volunteering effort worth at least 5 billion. So it's quite a strong call to action and definitely something that we need to think about going forward. So, who is that mysterious volunteer of the future? I hope I've managed to give you an idea of who this person is. And I've got some points here which I hope summarizes what we've talked about today. So this person is likely to be time poor, but someone who values their time, loyal to a cause rather than a brand or an organization, digitally aware, somebody who wants meaningful engagement. They want a mix of online and offline. They want flexibility in what we're offering them, and they may pay less attention to what we call volunteering and more attention to what that will actually achieve or what their time will achieve. Thanks for your questions, and we've selected several to answer. If you'd like to type some more questions, we're happy to receive them. So now's the time. Send us some more. We do have some, but just to make the most of the next 15 minutes. Make that bigger. Just looking at your questions. So I've got a question here from Abby. Thanks for your question, Abby. So Abby's question is there any research into volunteering in areas of deprivation, BME communities, and areas with particularly high levels of rural or social isolation? How does volunteering in these areas differ from the national trend, if at all? So that's from Abby, Girl Guiding. We don't have any research into BME communities, I'm afraid. I would say that more specialist organisations might do, and I can certainly look into that for you. We do have something in the almanac, which is quite interesting, however, around areas of deprivation. And what it shows is that formal volunteering, from what I remember from the slide, formal volunteering takes place less in areas of deprivation. Now, you can take from that what you will. You could say that in perhaps areas of greater deprivation, there are less formal structures or voluntary sector organisations, and therefore less activity. Doesn't necessarily mean, however, that there's less volunteering going on. It could be that there are greater numbers of, there's a greater amount of informal volunteering taking place in areas of higher deprivation. But it's worth looking at that slide. It is quite interesting. We don't also have any, we haven't really compared urban to rural areas, I'm afraid. We've never done that in the almanac. Perhaps that's something that we could do in the future. So I've got a question here from Marissa. So what examples are there of micro-volunteering roles that are not online or digitally based? So you could have things like proofreading a document. You could have things like, some people would say things like, sorry, go back up. That are not based online or digitally based. You can have things like doing collections, bucket collections, just practical things that don't involve. So you don't want things that are online. Things that involve people getting together in groups and one-off roles. So some of the examples that we've covered today would act as examples, but I can also think of some more and send you some. What's the best way to describe volunteering roles based on your research? For example, should we include volunteer in the role title? So that's from Lucy. Thanks for that, Lucy. I think it's a decision that you would need to make yourself as to whether you include volunteer in the role title. Some organisations I know feel much more secure by calling a role a volunteer role. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a volunteer role, because as we know from the volunteering and the law work that we've done, the training that we've delivered, some organisations don't treat their volunteers as volunteers, even though they may give them that title. So it is really about how you manage the volunteer rather than the name of the role that you give them. So I would just think about how you manage those volunteers and worry less about the titles that you give them. So, Paul, where do we find these future volunteers? What are the best channels for communication? Word of mouth is still one of the best ways of recruiting volunteers, getting people to recommend. You know, if somebody has a good volunteering experience and they go and they tell their friends about it, or if you say to them, could you bring a friend along, perhaps to a taster session, that's quite a safe way of bringing people in. Social media is increasingly being used to recruit volunteers. We don't really have any data on number of organisations that are using social media to do that. But we do know that for episodic volunteering, social media is quite helpful because it's just that light touch engagement where you can just bring people in as a one-off or on a limited time period. Sorry, I'm just looking, there's lots of good questions here. There's loads of good questions. I'm not quite sure, perhaps you could elaborate, Maria, in the next couple of minutes. I'm not quite sure what you mean, but, oh, sorry, I have understood your question now. Why are there no safeguards for volunteers? Do you mean that why are volunteers not treated, why don't volunteers have rights? I think that's what you mean by your question. Volunteers, if that is your question, because your question is why are there no safeguards for volunteers in law? So I'm just trying to interpret that. If that is your question, then the picture is at the moment that volunteers do not have a legal status, so they are not recognised in the eyes of the law. And that means that they don't have rights. They just don't have a legal status. We are doing an update of our volunteering and the law, and that will be available as a member resource from January on the Know-How Nonprofit member area of the website. And that goes into some detail as to the status of volunteers and how we can work with them and support them using appropriate legislation, even though they are not protected by employment rights. This is a lovely question here from Karen. So why do you think that young volunteers are important, and what tips would you recommend to encourage young people to volunteer? I would say that young people are probably best encouraged to volunteer by other young people who can be very positive ambassadors if they have had great experiences and can say, you know, come along, and can talk to them in their terms and almost in their language. So it doesn't necessarily have to feel as though young people have to volunteer. I have heard that if young people are applying for university now, the UCAS form asks for, it's not a compulsory thing that young people have had to have done, but it does ask for some examples of how young people have spent their time volunteering, and I think that's quite encouraging, but it's not a mandatory thing as well, which I think is also very encouraging. So I think that, getting young people to talk to other young people and encouraging them to come and find out what it's all about is probably the friendliest way to engage young people in volunteering. And, you know, young people are passionate and they care and they want to do things and change the world. They're probably not as jaded as older people. Or myself. So I think that, you know, I think just kind of jumping on that kind of passion, that shouldn't be a difficult thing to do. I mean, I often find the opposite is true, that young people are involved in probably too much and want to get involved in everything. So I don't actually think that should be too much of a terribly difficult challenge. Lots more questions coming in. Is there any data, this is from Leah, is there any data, anecdotal or otherwise, that people who have benefited from having a volunteer in the past are more likely to volunteer themselves? I think that there is some data, probably produced by the NCVO research team or by the Institute for Volunteering Research. So perhaps I can add that to one of the links at the end of the slides. I think there's lots of, we always post lots of, perhaps it doesn't constitute data, but it's sort of qualitative experience of people who write blogs for us every year for Volunteers Week, different angles of how volunteering has changed their lives, has helped them get a job, has reduced their isolation, has helped them through a difficult time, has inspired them to change their career. So there's lots of stories out there, and we always encourage organisations to gather those stories themselves, or certainly when a volunteer is leaving an organisation, if you could just somehow do a quick evaluation with them about what they've learned and what they've gained and what how this has helped them, then I think that there are lots of stories there that are just waiting to be unearthed. Are there countries in the world other than the UK which are more advanced with volunteering? Well, I know that there are countries in the world that are less advanced with volunteering. There are countries in the world, of course, where the concept of volunteering is perhaps less developed. The participation, the work that we've been doing and the slides that I've shared with you probably comes in quite useful here, because people might not think about volunteering in terms of that. They'll think about it in terms of community participation. So I think it's very much down to the culture of those countries. I know that in the US, they're very advanced with their volunteering, but they're sort of trailblazing in lots of different ways that you could look to them for some examples. NCVO is a member of the European Volunteering Centre, so there are some examples there around how they're sort of developing their own volunteering programs. But I don't think it's about the UK being most advanced, or even other countries being most advanced. I think it's about taking and sharing lessons about how volunteering happens. What are the barriers for people? How can we help to remove those barriers? What's our role in removing those barriers? How well are we supporting people to volunteer, and to also take that up as a lifelong journey, and not something that they kind of drop in and drop out of because we're not offering them the flexible opportunities. If volunteering is as a term is out of date, what options should we consider? I don't think volunteering as a term is out of date. I think that word is probably sticking in the vocabulary for some time, unless there's a massive movement where people decide that they just don't want to use that word. It becomes some kind of profanity. But it's not. People are happy to use the word, and there is no alternative. I mean, others might disagree. They might say that social action is the way forward. But I think the word volunteering is here to stay for the time being. As the definitions, this is from Amy, last question. As the definitions of volunteering change, what do you think this will do to how we measure impact? I don't think definitions of volunteering are changing. People will measure it in terms of how they give time. They'll measure it in terms of individual benefit, how a person is benefiting, how society is benefiting, how community has gained from that person giving their time and their skills. We do have a range. We have lots of different impact tools on our website which you can use and adapt. Lots of case studies as well on the Know How website, which you can use. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, and I don't think the definition is changing, as I said to answer Stuart's question previously. Thank you very much. Just a reminder then, thank you for all your questions, and I'm also going to add a couple of points to the slides before they go out to answer some of the questions that I wasn't able to cover quite in the webinar. Please complete the short feedback survey which appears when you exit the webinar. We'd be very grateful if you could do this, because we are looking to improve the webinars, and we'd be very grateful for your feedback. Thank you for joining this webinar.